Hello there. Welcome to video 124 from Sumit Academy. I do hope that you have subscribed to my channel. Do subscribe now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And do remember to like and share this video. And if you want to drop in a line, I shall always be available at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. To make your task a little easier, here is a complete list of all videos available on my YouTube channel. The list is divided into the playlists under which they are available. Do have a look. In this video, we shall talk about the meaning and types of inflation and have a look at its advantages and disadvantages. Inflation refers to a general rise in the level of prices. Its opposite is deflation, a general fall in the price level. It's an economics term that means you have to spend more to fill your petrol, buy a liter of milk, or get a haircut. In other words, it increases your cost of living. Inflation is the rate at which the cost of goods and services rises over time. It could also be thought of as a reduction in the value of a rupee because consumers are now able to purchase less than they previously could with the same rupee. Inflation refers to the rise in the prices of most goods and services of daily or common use, such as food, clothing, housing, recreation, transport, consumer staples, etc. It measures the average price change in a basket of commodities and services over time. Inflation is indicative of the decrease in the purchasing power of a unit of a country's currency. This is measured in percentage. Inflation reduces the purchasing power of each unit of currency, which leads to increase in the prices of goods and services over time. It occurs when there is a sustained increase in the general price level. Traditionally, high inflation rates are considered to be damaging to an economy. High inflation creates uncertainty and can wipe away the value of savings. However, most central banks target an inflation rate of 2%, suggesting that low inflation can have serious advantages to the economy. Some economists even argue we should target a higher inflation rate during periods of economic stagnation. But more about that a little later. Let us first have a look at the types of inflation. There are two main types of inflation: demand pull and cost push. Fueled by income and strong consumer demand, demand pull inflation occurs when the economy demands more goods and services than are available. If demand skyrockets but supply or the overall amount of goods and services remains the same, the demand pulls up the prices of things. Now let us see, you imagine that you own a bakery shop in your local town. If your community is doing well financially and people love your cakes and biscuits, the demand for them will increase. If you can't produce any more cakes and biscuits because you don't have enough ovens, the amount of items you can sell remains the same. But people want more of them. Thus, the value of your products increases, and so can your price. This is a very simple example. Demand pull inflation occurs on a grand scale across an entire economy. The second type of inflation, cost push inflation, happens when the demand for goods increases because production costs rise to the point where fewer goods can be produced. As demand remains the same, but the cost of supply increases, the price is pushed upward by supply costs. Now, coming back to the example of our bakery, imagine if people love your products and want to buy them, but a law has changed where you have to pay higher wages to your workers. Higher wages means it costs more for you to produce each cake, which means you will have to push prices higher to cover your costs. These are the two basic types of inflation. Inflation can, however, combine with other market forces to create an entirely new economic phenomenon. Other types of inflation include hyperinflation, a rapid and out of control form of inflation; pricing power inflation, which occurs when businesses raise prices to increase profits; sectoral inflation, which is when the rising prices are confined to just one industry; and stagflation, which occurs when inflation is rising despite slow economic growth. How does inflation affect interest rates? Well, inflation affects interest rates, which impacts how much it costs to borrow money. At the heart of the relationship between inflation and interest rates are real and nominal interest rates. Nominal interest rates are the interest rates advertised by your bank. They are, for example, the interest accrued on your savings in your savings account. The real interest rate is the nominal interest rate adjusted for inflation. In an economic scenario where there is 3% inflation and you have a variable rate interest loan at 10% interest, that's adjusted for inflation. The real interest rate you will pay is 13%. In other words, inflation can end up costing you more money. This is one way interest is impacted by inflation. The other is inflation can impact the federal funds rate. This rate, determined by the Reserve Bank, is the basis for loans throughout the country. When the federal funds rate is low, interest rates are low and borrowing money costs less, which drives up inflation. When the federal funds rate is high, interest rates are high and it's more expensive to borrow money, which is a measure that can help curb inflation. Now, in this connection, do see my earlier video on cash reserve ratio. As prices rise, a single unit of currency loses value as it buys fewer goods and services. This loss of purchasing power impacts the general cost of living for the common public, which ultimately leads to a deceleration in economic growth. The consensus view among economists is that sustained inflation occurs when a nation's money supply growth outpaces economic growth. To combat this, a country's appropriate monetary authority, like the Reserve Bank, then takes the necessary measures to keep inflation within permissible limits and keep the economy running smoothly. Inflation is measured in a variety of ways depending upon the types of goods and services considered, and is the opposite of deflation, which indicates a general decline occurring in prices for goods and services when the inflation rate falls below 0%. Strange as it may sound, there are some advantages of inflation. Let's have a look at them. First, deflation, a fall in prices, that is negative inflation, is very harmful. When prices are falling, people are reluctant to spend money because they feel that goods will be cheaper in the future. Therefore, they keep delaying purchases. Also, deflation increases the real value of debt and reduces the disposable income of individuals who are struggling to pay off their debt. When people take on a debt like a mortgage, they generally expect an inflation rate of 2% to help erode the value of debt over time. If this inflation rate of 2% fails to materialize, their debt burden will be greater than expected. Periods of deflation caused serious problems for the United Kingdom in the 1920s, Japan in the 1990s and 2000s, and Eurozone in 2010s. Second, moderate inflation enables adjustment of wages. It is argued a moderate rate of inflation makes it easier to adjust relative wages. For example, it may be difficult to cut nominal wages because workers resent and resist a nominal wage cut. But if average wages are rising due to moderate inflation, it is easier to increase the wages of productive workers. Unproductive workers can have their wages frozen, which is effectively a real wage cut. If we had zero inflation, we could end up with more real wage unemployment, with firms unable to cut wages to attract workers. Third, inflation enables adjustment of relative prices. Similar to the last point, moderate inflation makes it easier to adjust relative prices. This is particularly important for a single currency like the Eurozone. Southern European countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece became uncompetitive, leading to large current account deficit. Because Spain and Greece cannot devalue in the single currency, they have to cut relative prices to regain competitiveness. With very low inflation in Europe, this means they have to cut prices and cut wages, which cause lower growth due to the effects of deflation. If the Eurozone had moderate inflation, it would be easier for Southern Europe to adjust and be competitive without resorting to deflation. Fourth, inflation can boost growth. At times of very low inflation, the economy may be stuck in a recession. Arguably, targeting a higher rate of inflation can enable a boost in economic growth. But this view is controversial. Not all economists would support targeting a higher inflation rate. However, some would target higher inflation if the economy was stuck in a prolonged recession. For example, the Eurozone had a very low inflation rate in 2013-14, and this corresponded to very weak economic growth and very high employment. If the ECB had been willing to target higher inflation, then we could have seen a rise in Eurozone GDP. Fifth, inflation is better than deflation. The only thing worse than inflation is deflation. A fall in prices can cause an increase in the real debt burden and discourage spending and investment. Deflation was a factor in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, let us move on to the disadvantages of inflation. First, inflation is usually considered to be a problem when the inflation rate rises above 2%. The higher the inflation, the more serious the problem is. In extreme circumstances, hyperinflation can wipe away people's savings and cause great instability. For example, Germany 1920s, Hungary 1940s, Zimbabwe 2000s. However, in a modern economy, this kind of hyperinflation is rare. Usually, inflation is accompanied with higher interest rates, so savers do not see the savings wiped away. However, inflation can still cause problems. Inflationary growth tends to be unsustainable, leading to a damaging period of boom and bust economic cycles. For example, the United Kingdom saw high inflation in the late 1980s, but this economic boom was unsustainable, and when the government tried to reduce inflation, it led to the recession of 1990-92. Second, inflation tends to discourage investment and long-term economic growth. This is because of the uncertainty and confusion that is more likely to occur during periods of high inflation. Low inflation is said to encourage greater stability and encourage firms to take risks and invest. Third, inflation can make an economy uncompetitive. For example, a relatively higher rate of inflation in Italy can make Italian exports uncompetitive, leading to a current account deficit and lower economic growth. This is particularly important for countries in the Eurozone because they can't devalue to restore competitiveness. Fourth, inflation reduces the value of savings as it leads to a fall in the value of money. This makes savers worse off if inflation is higher than interest rates. High inflation can lead to a redistribution of income in society. Often, it is pensioners who lose out most from inflation. This is particularly a problem if inflation is high and interest rates low. Fifth, menu costs. The cost of changing price lists becomes more frequent during high inflation. However, this is not so significant with modern technology. Sixth, fall in real wages. In some circumstances, high inflation can lead to a fall in real wages. If inflation is higher than nominal wages, then real incomes fall. This was a problem in the Great Recession of 2008 to 16, with prices rising faster than incomes. Now, you may well ask me as to why do we target inflation of 2% rather than 0%? Well, inflation of 0% is close to deflation, and deflation imposes a different type of cost on the economy. Therefore, inflation of 2% has certain benefits. Firstly, it allows prices and wages to adjust. It avoids the risk of deflation. And as we have seen, deflation is potentially damaging because it increases the real value of debt. Secondly, it can discourage spending because consumers expect prices to keep falling. It can make monetary policy ineffective as you can't have negative interest rates. Next, our next doubt is to who measures inflation? Well, inflation is measured by a central government authority which is in charge of adopting measures to ensure the smooth running of the economy. In India, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation measures inflation. And how is inflation measured? In India, inflation is primarily measured by two main indices. The WPI, that is the Wholesale Price Index, and the CPI, Consumer Price Index, which measure wholesale and retail level price changes respectively. The Consumer Price Index calculates the difference in the price of commodities and services such as food, medical care, education, electronics, etc., which Indian consumers buy for use. On the other hand, the goods or services sold by businesses to smaller businesses for selling further is captured by the WPI. In India, both WPI and CPI are used to measure inflation. Over the last decade, inflation has emerged as a leading concern of India's economic policy makers and citizens. Worries grew as the inflation rate, which is measured as the 12-month change in the consumer price index, rose from 3.7% to 12.1% over 2001-2010. The inflation rate has since fallen to 5.2% in early 2015, leading to a debate about whether this moderation is likely to endure or inflation will rise again. So what happened? India's inflation rate for 2016 was 4.94%, a 0.93% decline from 2015. So far, so good. Then, in 2017, it was 2.49%, a 2.45% decline from 2016. Then came 2018 and the inflation rate was 4.86%, a 2.37% increase from 2017. And our inflation rate for 2019 was 7.66%, a 2.8% increase from 2018. Consumer prices in India increased 6.69% year on year in August of 2020, following a downwardly revised 6.73% rise in the previous month and below market forecasts of 6.85%. Still, the inflation remains above the RBI upper band 2% to 6% target range. A slowdown was seen for food, 9.05% versus 9.27%. Prices of vegetables went up 11.41%, pulses 14.44%, cereals 5.92%, meat and fish 16.5%, and sugar 3.93%. Other increases were recorded for fuel and light 3.1%, clothing and footwear 2.77%, transport 11.1%, and education 1.61%. Now, let us see as to what steps can be taken to control inflation. There are certain measures that are employed by the Reserve Bank of India to restrict inflation and control cash flow. The first such step is repo rate. This is the percentage at which RBI lends money to commercial banks. The repo rate is very important in terms of the monetary outflow from the government. The repo rate comes into play usually when commercial banks are short of money and need to borrow from the RBI. Another important instrument is the CRR, the cash reserve ratio, which is employed by the RBI as the amount commercial banks need to keep with them by default. Reverse repo rate is another consideration, as it is the rate at which commercial banks lend money to the RBI. Now, in this connection, do see my earlier videos on sovereign credit rating, cash reserve ratio, and individual credit rating for a detailed analysis on the subject. However, let us see these briefly here. First, repo rate. Whenever commercial banks face a shortage of funds, they can approach the RBI for a loan. The repo rate is the rate at which it would be possible for commercial banks to borrow money from the RBI. Repo rate is often used by the government as a tool for inflation. Whenever the government wants to restrict the flow of money in the economy, it can increase the repo rate as a deterrence for commercial banks to borrow money. Thus, repo rate makes for a very important financial instrument that is reflexively used to restrict the quantity of cash. Second, CRR, cash reserve ratio. CRR is another measure that is used in controlling the amount of money the commercial banks are able to circulate into the economy. This is because CRR represents a certain amount of money that commercial banks are by law stipulated to keep with the RBI. Inflation can be directly controlled by the central government simply by means of increasing the CRR rate and thereby restricting the ability of commercial banks to lend money. Third, reverse repo rate. Reverse repo rate is the rate at which the RBI borrows from commercial banks. This is part of a liquidity adjustment facility employed by central banks to resolve short-term cash shortages that an economy might end up facing. Reverse repo rate is usually set 1 percentile lower than the existing repo rate. This is also done in a bid to control inflation, as reverse repo rate helps RBI extract money from the economy when it feels like there is excessive cash rolling about in the economy. In conclusion, we do understand that there is a need to control inflation. When the quantity of money rises above a certain threshold, the increased buying power of the consumer class can lead to a shortage of goods and services. This is because capitalism, which thrives on the idea that infinite resources can be employed to satiate the needs of a growing demographic, is slightly flawed. This is what generates the need for measures like the repo rate, CRR, and the reverse repo rate. They help restrict cash flow and keep inflation in check. These measures help bring a certain balance to the whole economic framework that the world laboriously functions under. Central banks, like the Reserve Bank of India, use certain methods to maintain a level of balance to the Indian economy. These help keep the economy fresh and vibrant. This is because controlling inflation is a highly critical step in the direction of conceiving a system that is financially reaching an equilibrium. Inflation is like a hydra-headed monster which should be fought by using all the weapons at the command of the government. Well, that's all from me in this video. This video is based on information freely available on the internet. No originality is claimed for the same. The intention of this video is only to prepare candidates for answering examination questions on the subject. Do like and share this video and do subscribe to my channel now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And if you wish to drop in a line, I shall always be available at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. Till later then, cheerio.